and welcome Dr. Francisco Dominguez, who um, is no stranger to CLS. He's graced many of our meetings and for me, one of the most informed people about what's happening down there in Latin America. So without much ado, Francisco, please take the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Luke. You can call me Francisco so you don't have trouble with the surname.
Okay.
But thanks anyway. This is a real privilege and a pleasure to be invited to speak at your meetings. The elections in the United States, I think, reflect that the country is going through what I would call a gigantic political, economic, constitutional, sin soul crisis. The election of Donald Trump on the platform that he won is a clear indication of this. The first thing I want to say about the actual election itself is that he was elected not with a landslide. This is a myth. If you look at the actual figures, he got on this occasion 76 million votes and a bit more, and Kamala Harris got 74 million votes. If you were to compare the election in 2020, Joe Biden in 2020 got 81 million votes, and Donald Trump at the time got 74 million. But if you were to concentrate on this particular election, the difference between the two, between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, in percentage terms, is 1.6. That is to say, Trump won in terms of the overall vote by 1.6. And you can see the difference between what Kamala Harris obtained, 74 million, compared to Joe Biden in 2020, which was 81 million. That is to say, between 8 to 10 million people who voted for the Democrats last time did not vote for the Democrats this time and did not go over to Trump. So that's the first clear feature of the election. But I think the second important thing is this. In the year from 2020 to 2024, profits for companies in the United States grew by more than 64% overall. And unions where they exist in the United States are entitled to get information about the profitability and profits that their companies get. And this is very central to part and parcel of their collective bargaining when it comes to them discussing wages. So they were aware, totally aware, that in terms of their own wages in the same period, 2020-2024, the wages of the working class in the United States overall went up only by 18%, and it did not keep up with inflation. If you were to spend a week in the United States, it would be extremely expensive. I mean, if you think about groceries, milk, rent, and everything else, it's very, very difficult for people, who actually their income is between $20,000 to $30,000 a year, which is a very large proportion of the population. They could not really, they find it very tough to survive. It's not poverty as it is in Latin America, but it is very bad indeed. And I think these people listen to the promises made by Joe Biden, the Democrats, and Kamala Harris, and because they saw no serious measure being taken to actually improve the situation where there was plenty of money around, is that they decided to actually not vote for the Democrats. I think that's one important dimension in terms of the overall number of people that did not vote for them. The number two, I think a very significant proportion of the voters that voted traditionally for the Democrats did not do so because of the wars in which the United States is involved. I think particularly damaging for the Democrats, electorally speaking, was the situation in Gaza. We know that Netanyahu was bombing Gaza out of existence, with 40-something, 43, 44,000 people being butchered literally every day with US weapons. They knew this. So I think there is an important proportion that of those people who did not vote, and you can tell that it was an important proportion because of the level of mobilizations that took place in the previous period in the United States against the war. I think when it comes to the question of the Ukraine, the situation is more complicated regarding politics in the United States. So that's the first installment I want to make. The second part is what exactly he is likely to do, that is to say, Donald Trump. We have some idea of what he's going to do, although until he actually does it, we cannot be absolutely 100% certain that he will do what he's saying he's going to do. So let me start first with the domestic side of things. I think he's going to go for this almost certainly. On the international arena, things are more complicated. So let me come back to that later. On the domestic arena, what he's going to do, he's going to purge the state. And one of the purges of the state is going to be that he's got plans, which have been not necessarily leaked, but quite openly released, that he wants to get rid of generals who are complicating the life of the United States. That is to say, generals that he understands will not be prepared to obey his orders in terms of wars and so on in the future. So he's likely, he said, he's going to, I'm using the word purge myself, he's not using that word himself, purge the Pentagon, the Secretary of Defense. But also he's going to do a massive purge, and this is very, very intense in terms of their propaganda and intentions, to purge the Department of Justice. If in the United States political system you control the judiciary, you control a great deal of it. Not necessarily everything, but it will give you a tremendous amount of leeway and power to do what you want, because normally the Department of Justice is the one mechanism that's been stopping excesses from previous presidents, including himself. So he wants to get rid of them, and the figure that's been bandied about of the number of people who he's going to get rid of, that he intends to get rid of, is between 25 to 50,000 of them. So the idea is to make the Department of Justice an instrument in his transformation of the country in terms of his slogan, which is "Make America Great Again," MAGA, which is the slogan of the extreme right wing in the United States. So that's quite an important dimension of it. And then in terms of the politics of the situation, particularly in terms of the elections, the electoral rights, would you believe it, the United States doesn't have a federal law that rules elections? The legislation and the law of elections is applied by the states individually. So there are 50 sets of laws. So law, states within the federation, where the Supreme Court, the legislative, the local assembly, the judges and the political establishment are actually extreme Republicans, they can do whatever they want, literally. And they can pass the most extraordinary piece of legislation in terms of election, and that would be completely legitimate but legal. That's the key. And there is no mechanism in terms of the international, in terms of the national legislation that actually can rectify this. So what is important in this regard is that the Republicans over the last period have been very busily suppressing, putting restrictions, eliminating people from the electoral rolls in huge quantities, as much as they can. We are aware, certainly I'm aware, that in the last 2-3 years, the Republicans actually entered into litigations, about 1,000 litigations to suppress the number of people that were voting in several places. And the target is always the same: Black people and Latino voters. Those are the two key constituencies that they're trying to suppress as much as possible. Let me give you one example. There was one state, I think it was Georgia, where they passed a resolution, because the Republicans control that, by which you could vote by postal vote, and they send you the information to your home address, obviously, as a voter, in a very small letter, very small print. They told you that unless you wrote on the actual envelope your date of birth with a pen, by hand, that vote would be annulled. And many people did not read the small print. So the number of people that they actually suppressed in Georgia in those elections was amazing. In Texas, one of the characteristics of the practice of elections in there is that in constituencies, in areas, in polling stations which are white, the process is very fast, and the reason is very hot. It's so hot. So it's very fast, and people can stay there, vote, and go back home to their air-conditioned houses. But when it comes to the constituency where Black people vote, then the process is extremely and deliberately slow. It lasts hours, to the point that people start to faint in the queues. And this is not an exaggeration. So what happens in that state, people started to bring bottles of water to help people, to give them some water while they were waiting. They passed a legislation forbidding people offering water to the people in the queues. It was illegal. You'd be arrested if you actually brought water to people waiting in the queues. So that gives you an idea of how arbitrary it can be in the United States when the Republicans, not exclusively, but particularly Republicans, get on to their job. So that is what is going on. So you can imagine now that the Republicans won the House of Representatives. They have a majority. They won the Senate. They have a majority. They have the presidency. They're going to have all the ministries. And they have on their side massively the Supreme Court. In the past, whenever there was any abuse by the presidency, not exclusively, but mainly, then people actually had the possibility of litigating the thing all the way to the Supreme Court. But now the Supreme Court has accepted, the principle that the president enjoys total immunity whilst in office, and then can commit any crime which will enjoy immunity and impunity. This is a formal ruling of the Supreme Court. So you can imagine, he's got every imaginable thing on his side to do whatever he wants, more or less. So that's the domestic part. Let me come quickly onto the final part, the external foreign policy. I think very likely that he's going to intensify the US aggression and aggressiveness against China. He may, leave Russia alone for a while. I don't know exactly how that is going to pan out. There are several proposals that have been bandied about and so on. But I think the Democrats and the Republicans have a tactical difference. The tactical difference is this. The Democrats thought, this is my own interpretation, but I think it's been confirmed by many analysts. If you're able to sort out Russia, then you isolate China from, this very powerful nation in terms of nuclear weapons. And therefore, you get rid of that complication and you can attack China really hard. Whereas on the other side, the Republicans, certainly Donald Trump, thinks that what you need to do is to keep Russia calm while you concentrate completely on China and make concessions to Russia so that you bring them onto your side. Once and if they manage to get China sorted out, they'll come back on Russia anyway, as you'd expect. So there is a tactical difference. It's quite important to make this point because many people and many media are suggesting Trump is a peaceful maker, he wants to peace in the world and so on, which is not true at all. When it comes to the question of Latin America, he has appointed Marco Rubio, an extreme right-winger from a Cuban origin in Florida, as a state secretary. So you can imagine the United States is going to massively intensify the pressure on the key three countries, which is going to be Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba. And then from there on, it's going to continue with everything else. Over the last period, during the Joe Biden administration, the person who was making the runs in terms of foreign policy in the continent, in the Western Hemisphere, as they call it, in Latin America, has been none other than Laura Richardson, who was the general in charge of the Southern Command. That is to say, the military, the Pentagon, in our hemisphere, in the Latin American, Caribbean hemisphere, was making the run. And she went around making the following point. We cannot allow the Latin American countries to enter into agreements with countries outside the hemisphere, which are hostile to the United States. We're not going to allow that. And she went around installing as many military bases as she could everywhere. So she installed some in Ecuador because there is a right-wing administration there. She installed another one in Argentina because there is a right-wing administration there, and installed some in Chile because there is a weakened, very weak and, I would say, duplicitous administration there, and is negotiating with as many other countries as possible. So now Trump has announced his policy towards Latin America, as well as to the rest of the world, which is the imposition of tariffs. He's got a very simplistic and naive concept of economics. He doesn't understand it, but it's something that, they want to use, which is tariff is a punishment, it's like an economic punishment against somebody who is importing into your economy more efficiently than you can produce. Let me give you an idea. The electric vehicles produced by China on average cost something like $20,000. The average electric vehicle produced by Tesla, by Elon Musk, actually costs $40,000 or $45,000, double. So when they come into the United States, the consumer is going to go for the cheaper one. And the quality of the Chinese vehicles, are absolutely excellent. So to impose tariffs on them is a deterrence to ensure that the consumer cannot consume them because they're going to be too expensive as a result of that tax when they come in. The problem is this, that Trump seems to believe that who is going to pay the extra money is going to be the exporter, in this case China. And the United States is going to collect the money, which is completely ridiculous. All it's going to do is going to increase the prices of the vehicles inside the United States. Biden kept some of the sanctions, some of the tariffs that Trump imposed against China in his administration trade war against China, which ran in the region of nearly 400 billion, which is a huge amount. So now Trump has announced two more things. He's going to apply tariffs against Mexico and Canada. These three were the North American Free Trade Agreement, the free trade area that actually, allowed the United States a huge amount of leeway since 1994, when it was founded in the first place. So this is really making the situation of Mexico rather uncomfortable and perhaps dangerous potentially, because Mexico imports and exports something like 84 to 85% to and from the United States. So it's extremely dependent compared to other countries which are not that dependent, such as Brazil, Venezuela, and others who actually have a more diversified set of foreign traders or foreign partners. And the latest announcement that Trump has made, and I'll finish with this, is that he's going to actually apply tariffs against the BRICS. And his arguments against the BRIC countries, which is China, India, Russia, Brazil, and then Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, and so on, Algeria. And his argument is he's going to apply any sanctions against them, not sanctions, but tariffs against them, if they intend to weaken the dollar. The BRICS and other countries have been very busy trying to ensure that they don't use the dollar as much, because the United States weaponizes the use of the dollar against country that he doesn't, against government that doesn't like, with terrible consequences. So, in a nutshell, and I'll end with this: if all of this is done, that is to say, everything he says he's going to do is actually implemented, what Trump will end up doing is cause a huge amount of chaos domestically as well as internationally, but it's going to massively accelerate the terrible and severe decline of the United States. So it's going to get very bumpy, but it's not going to be in their benefit. So we have to keep a steady hand and then organize solidarity, with everything. He's going to go for the weakest one first, and then go for everybody else. Anyway, I'll leave it there because otherwise we'll get too long. There are more details, but I think it's better. I better stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francisco, for that wide explanation of what's happening with Trump in the world. I had to just go to the door for a minute, and so I didn't get to hear if you said anything about Europe, because I know there's Britain and some European countries are a bit nervous about Trump in office, and especially whether he will continue to support NATO alliance and so on. So I don't know if you mentioned that in the few moments that I was. If not, if you can just.
No, I didn't. But what I can do is I could take a few questions so that I don't.
Yes. Okay. We've got
maximize the amount of time.
We've got Laura. Laura, please come in with your question. You got to unmute. Yep. There you go.
It's not really a question. It's more of a comment. Thank you, Francisco. As an American, I tend to read almost everything that comes from the States. The state election system is actually somewhat more complex than just the states having the power, because in most of the states, the localities also make their own rules. So my favorite, and the one I keep telling people to watch, is that there's a little town in upstate New Hampshire where my cousin lives. It's called Dixville Notch, and it has 30 people living in it. And so what they do is that they open the polls because they're allowed to. I think it's funny, but it gives you an idea. They open the polls at midnight for half an hour. All the people come and vote. There are 30 votes. They are always the first to send in their voting. Last time it was equal to Democrats and Republicans, 15 each. This time it was mostly Republicans with, I think, 2 Democrats. So it must make discussions on the street corner a little difficult. But one of the problems is every time you move anywhere, every time you even move 5 miles, you might be going, and Americans move a lot more than than English people do. You're having to organize yourself into a completely different system. And the other thing is that what some states did, they sought permission from the Supreme Court, which they got, to take off the voting registers, which are always held at the state level, for people that they decided were either not registered to vote or had died or whatever. So before the election, several of the southern states actually culled thousands of voters from the voting register so that people would show up and find out they're no longer registered to vote. And that created quite a lot of people stayed home, actually, I understand, in some of these states. But people who did show up basically had no recourse at that point because it was all done before they got there. So basically you'd have to start again to sign up for voting in that area. That's it. I just wanted, and thank you very much. I thought that was really very informative.
Thank you. Thank you for that comment, Laura. Francisco, I don't know if you want to respond to anything there and to my question.
I
But
think Ozzy wants to.
Ozzy, okay, let's take Ozzy's question same time. Ozzy, you want to comment?
Yeah, muchas gracias, Francisco, por su presentación. I particularly appreciated how concise and insightful it was. My question is this. In addition to what Trump does, what we have to pay careful attention to is what it influences. What I mean by that is when he was elected in 2016, you saw that somehow inspired an open rise of what Zizek calls soft fascism across the globe, but also particularly in Latin America. So I would really like to hear your thoughts on what does a second Trump, what is likely to be the influence of a second Trump elections on fascism or soft fascism in Latin America and the Caribbean, or more so Latin America. And of course, I'm thinking particularly Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, Honduras, Guatemala, Colombia even, yeah?
Thank you. Thank you, Ozzy. Okay, Francisco, you want to take those questions
Yeah.
for now?
Oh, great question. Thank you. Let me first deal with the voting system that Laura mentioned. I mean, obviously, the further down you go, the more complicated it gets. It's an incredibly chaotic system, and it allows those in power to suppress anybody. And in the United States, I think the Republicans have a dream that they never quite voiced publicly, which is to go back to 1861. So the Black people never had the right. Remember, when the Civil War was won by the North, you know, in the South, they applied segregation in practice. The Jim Crow system, which actually prevented, you know, Black people from ages. I mean, there was segregation of the worst imaginable time, with violence, abuse, and everything, all the way up to 1965, 67. And the Black community had to fight really hard, you know, in order to actually get somewhere that is still, you know, fighting against the attempt to return them back to that position. I think all the time when I think about this is of a song by Billie Holiday, which is called Strange Fruits, which is just, you know, she's talking about trees that she sees from the distance. And she's hanging on from their strange fruit, which is Black people who have been hanged. Not one, several. And actually there are pictures of this. So this idea of lynching, you know, is something that, you know, the racists in the United States consider is a sort of divine right because they're superior. And white supremacy expresses violently. And I think Trump is definitely, you know, in that category. So that brings me on to the third question. I'll come back to finally to the question of Yuri in a second. I think it's going to boost the extreme right-wing proto-fascist or fascist currents in Latin America. I mean, if you think of the paramilitary operation and paramilitary structures of the Colombian oligarchy, which is lethal, you know, they assassinated in what, 10, 15 years, nearly 200,000 people. Literally as a sort of machine, a killing machine. And they want to come back. And there is no re-election in the case of Colombia. So Gustavo Petro, who is a fantastic president, very progressive, and is trying to do plenty of things, is not going to be able to actually stand again. And we do not know what the position is going to be after that. And they've been making their life very miserable. And with Trump on top of things, then he's definitely going to help the right wing in Colombia, because the United States strategically has 10 military bases in Colombia, which will allow the United States to attack Venezuela and get their hands on that oil, which they so much want. So therefore, you know, the potential there is gigantic. So that's number one. In Argentina, given that it is in the southern cone, you can attack Venezuela from the side, from Colombia, and then you can attack from the south, which is, from Argentina. And Argentina in the past was a country that offered military to actually go into Nicaragua and sort them out in a sort of international military force. And he offered that also with Venezuela under Chavez. So the conditions are there, and Javier Milei, who needs, in my view, I can say this publicly, needs psychiatric help, but he's also a fascist. That's the main problem. And he's doing the worst imaginable thing to Argentina. The number in 1 year, 1.5 years of his administration, he has increased the proportion of poor people in Argentina from 41 to 55. So there are more poor people, which is desperate people now in Argentina than there were before. And he's really going massively, for getting rid of all the rights. And Argentina was one of the countries most developed in terms of the welfare state. And then we have Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro is being indicted in Brazil right now because he was revealed that he was organizing a coup d'etat with sections of the military. The military were in power for more than 20 years in Brazil. The military in Brazil liked the idea of they can organize a sort of tutelage over the civilian administration, so they do what they want. And if they don't, then they can come in. And they tried to come in, in when Lula won the election. Now Bolsonaro and several of the top brass have been indicted, and they're going to face the music. Very likely they're going to be in jail. So again, both, Trump is going to come in this way. And in the case of Chile, just to mention the ones that Ozzy mentioned, in the case of Chile, the candidate that nearly won the election when Gabriel Boric was elected is a guy called Jose Antonio Cast, who is a fascist, a declared fascist. He's a son of a Nazi, of a German Nazi. And, he's Chilean because he grew up there and so on. And he was proposing, Cast was proposing the Pinochet constitution multiplied by 5, that is to say, much, much worse. And then you have the situation potentially in El Salvador, certainly in Central America. And I think Trump is going to do everything in his power. And one of the key things which we need to really look carefully about is the situation in Bolivia, where there is a very difficult situation being faced by the progressive movement, which is not helping them, and is certainly helping the right wing. And Bolivia has the largest deposit of lithium in the world. And the United States is not in a position to exploit that lithium as well as anybody else, but it wants to prevent somebody else, namely China, from actually making a deal with Bolivia to produce the best thing out of that in the benefit of Bolivia. So given that the situation, the potential for Trump to really help the extreme right wing massively with resources, support, logistical support, the media and everything else is gigantic. So, it's going to be very bumpy indeed. I think we can win, but it's not going to be easy. And finally, Europe. What Trump is saying to Europeans who seem to be terrified because they went into this adventure in the Ukraine, and now, they're losing the war massively, and they don't know what to do. They expected Russia to collapse, and quite the opposite. Russia has been strengthened massively economically as well. And so Trump is saying, okay, if you want me to support you, with our military apparatus, which is the only one capable of supporting them in the circumstances where there to be an overall war, is the United States said, well, you have to pay more. In other words, you have to fund the NATO. And he doesn't like NATO apparently because it means expending money that he doesn't want the United States to spend, and he doesn't like the Europeans because as far as he's concerned, they're too radical. Imagine the British government or the French Macron being radical in that sense. So these hugely deeply ingrained prejudices that they have against anything which is progressive is such a playing his role in defining an important part of his policy. We'll see what he does eventually. when it comes to Europe. And the main problem that they have with Europe now is a trade deficit of something like $200 to $300 billion per year, which, you know, it means the United States is going to retaliate. I'll leave it there. Thank you. You're muted, Luke.
Sorry about that. My screen changed a little bit. Thank you for those replies to those questions. We've got one other question we'll take, and then we'll go on to the next speaker. So unless there's a burning question that pops up very quickly, Stephen, if you come in with your question.
Yes, greetings, everyone. Great presentation. Two questions. One, what will this election of the incoming president mean when it pertains to the gas deal that's been signed between Venezuela and Trinidad and Tobago to provide gas to Trinidad and Tobago, which could then be piped throughout the Caribbean? Do you see that? Do you see the incoming president trying to block that in any way? And some oil and gas reserves, I believe it has been found off of Gaza in the oceans, large reserves, which Syria apparently has some control over. How do you see that playing into the mix, especially with what's going on in Gaza and Syria, especially with the last military action that's taken place? Thank you.
And there is one by Joseph, I think.
I didn't hear.
Oh, yes, there's Joseph. Yes, Joseph, you want to come in with your question?
Yeah, it's more of information. I really want to thank Francisco because this is what I know, especially in terms of the voting system in the States where a lot of Black and Latino people were affected. There was actually a movie, a documentary that came out just before the election. I was trying to find the link to share it, but I haven't seen it yet. And then in terms of Latin America, there's some documents as outlined through the Atlantic Council. I think our people need to become more savvy, more knowledgeable about those positions that the U.S. have, especially in relation to Latin America and the Caribbean. Because many times we are very ignorant. I saw the same woman he mentioned, the military woman, outlining some of those policies in videos. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joseph. Francisco?
Yeah.
Your final question there.
Yeah.
Because of time. Thanks.
I know I'm taking time. So
No, you're doing good. It's great.
Well, knowing the United States and knowing Trump, whether he's Democrat or Republican, they're going to try to complicate the agreement no matter what with Trinidad and Tobago. You know, this is Joe Biden went in the past under Obama to the Caribbean with some very threatening remarks, saying that given that Venezuela was going to collapse anyway, what about the United States were to replace Venezuela with, through which Venezuela was supplying oil at very convenient prices on excellent contracts and loans to the 13 Caribbean nations. What about if the United States were to replace them, sell them liquid gas, which is 3-4 times more expensive? And he really put pressure on them, and the Caribbean decided, the CARICOM said, no, we are not interested. So I take it that from that point of view, given that what the United States offering alternatively is much worse for everybody in the Caribbean, and given that the Caribbean has showed that it's got some serious backbone, I think it's unlikely to say yes, but they will exert pressure as much as they can. When it comes to gas, it seems to me that the United States has lost a significant amount of positions in Iraq, in Iran, in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, and so on, and it's sort of desperate. And the only place it can really go for is the weakest one, which is Gaza, through a proxy, which is, as we know, is Israel. So now that the huge amount of oil and gas, particularly, has been discovered in Gaza. But the United States is not going to try to, to leave the place. And he's trying to find a way, this is what Joe Biden tried to do, trying to find a way to actually have military troops formally in the place in order to buttress that position. I think they want to make Gaza disappear, and they want to make Cisjordan disappear, and they want to make that part of Israel which will be protected by the United States militarily. That's at least is the plan, so that on the argument that Israel has the right to defend itself, blah blah blah, and all the rest of it, we'll see how far it goes, because you cannot make a nation disappear, and they find it very difficult now with having so many fronts open in Syria, in Yemen, in Gaza, and in Lebanon. This is not sustainable. So we'll see what happens. I think people are going to continue to resist. When it comes to an interesting thing, which I was going to mention, but I'm going to mention now, regarding the last question, which is, there is a very significant protagonic role that the Black leadership within the Democratic Party and in society as a whole in the United States are playing. It's very significant. It's very impressive. And it's fantastic. And it's very united. It's quite coherent. It's not perfect by any means. Many of them actually, as you know, are in the Democratic Party. This doesn't apply to the Latino communities, because we thought at one point, given the progressive developments in Latin America, there was going to be a sort of mirror of that inside the United States. This has not happened. And the reason is there are many nationalities, Nicaraguans, Colombians, Cubans, and so on. And they are very divided. They're divided regionally as well as on nationality, and they have different status in different places, depending on where they are, how long they've been there, and so on. So their response has been quite fragmented, particularly regarding this election. Whereas the Black communities have been quite much better united, not perfect, but much better. And if you think of, people such as the excellent politician, in my view, even though she's in the Democratic Party, Stacey Abrams, such as fantastic leader, and plenty of others, young, elected leaders in the local assembly, in the state assembly in Tennessee, for example, and so on. I mean, it's really, really impressive. And the people in the streets, the actual social movements that exist. And if there is this connection, I think it is possible that something interesting emerges out of that. And certainly if there's going to be resistance, I think that's going to be the first line of resistance, the Black community. Then secondly, perhaps the working class. Mainly thirdly, women because of abortion, and then finally the Latinos. And if you're able to put that coalition together for resistance, you can have something very serious there. But we have to wait and see. Thank you very much again.
Thank you so much, Francisco. I think we've exhausted a lot of the issues for the region and the world in this short space.